Good morning, everyone who has joined us here today. We're delighted to have you here at the first of a three-part series of the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies annual conference. Today's conference is titled Navigating North Africa in 2020, Dominating Narratives and New Perspectives. The second IMIS conference will take place in fall 2021, which will be focused on the Gulf and Iran, and the third in autumn 2022, focused on the Levant and Israel. My name is Ennahda, and I'm delighted to be co-hosting this year's conference with Inga Christina Trautig, which you'll be meeting later this morning. We are the co-founding members of the PhD student-run Middle East North Africa Research Group, which falls under the auspices of the King's Institute of Middle Eastern Studies. The MENA Research Group and the three-part series conference was a brainchild of Inga and mine. We're keen to bring together an academic conference with a twist, senior academics, early academics, and researchers, as well as experiences of on-the-ground experts to hold dynamic and engaging conversations and insights. North Africa is rapidly transforming, but each of its 5 constituent countries are following markedly different trajectories. This conference will offer new perspectives on how to analyze North African developments in 2020. We're going to identify cross-cutting themes and provide insights into the current challenges and dominating narratives in the region. We will then delve into grassroots movements and religious voices looking to create peaceful initiatives. And then we will look more broadly at the transregional threats and impacts on the region. We are very grateful for all of our speakers here today, but we also know we have an accomplished audience today with each of you equally talented in your own field, many whom do not focus on day in, day out in the academic realm, but who can provide an additional perspective in the conversation. We are hoping for a dynamic engagement today and for you, the audience, to engage on the matters discussed here today by each of our esteemed panelists. Although it is unfortunate we cannot meet in person, but this online format allows us to keep engaging with the global community on this important region. On behalf of my colleagues, I thank you for your time and forthcoming questions you will have.
Thanks very much, Ennahda, and hello from a sunny Tunis. It's a very pleasant 23 degrees here today, and I'm delighted to join you. And welcome to everyone at this year's Institute of Middle Eastern Studies annual conference. The Institute of Middle Eastern Studies is just over 2 years old, and it was set up to bring together scholars and students at King's College London interested in and working on the Middle East and North Africa. We have over 30 academic members based in 10 departments, spread across the social sciences and arts and humanities. And thanks to Ennahda and Inga's efforts with the MENA Research Group, we are engaging with an ever greater number of PhD and MA students. In addition to serving our own community, to supporting scholars and students at King's, the Institute also seeks to showcase the work of KCL to the wider research and practitioner community to help anchor KCL within that community. That is why events like today's conference are so important, especially at the moment, given what is happening in the world and the challenges that this poses to anyone interested in studying, learning about and conducting research in this fascinating part of the world. When Ennahda, Inga and I first discussed holding a conference, we of course planned on it being a physical affair conference. Yet when the COVID crisis first began, I feared that we would have to cancel, that we wouldn't be able to go ahead. Very happily, however, Ennahda and Inga have been able to retool what they had and to organize the conference as an entirely virtual event. And if there is a silver lining to the current situation, as Ennahda alluded to our enforced separation and to social distancing, it is that events like this, that remote events like this can reach and involve far more people than a conventional conference. Indeed, as of this morning, just over 400 people had registered to participate, which is far more than could have been involved if we'd kept to the original plan. And when I first started my own PhD on Algeria 20 years ago, happily I've submitted since then, North Africa and Maghreb studies in the UK was a very small affair. It is wonderful, therefore, very gratifying to see so many people interested in the region today, and to have so many young scholars carrying out innovative and interesting work on the region. I'm really looking forward to hearing the presentations. We've got 3 wonderful panels covering a fascinating blend of topics and countries. Before I finish though, I'd just like to thank a few people, starting with George Hodgson, our keynote speaker, for taking the time to talk to us. In addition to dealing with COVID, he is having to contend with the merging of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office with the Department for International Development, as well as making sure that the everyday bread and butter work of the UK's embassies and high commissions in the region continues to take place. Thank you also to our panel chairs and to our presenters for your involvement and engagement throughout the day. Without you, we obviously wouldn't have a conference at all. Thanks very much to Lizzie Allen, Daniel Mansfield, and Achia Alua for everything that they have done behind the scenes. And finally, a very big thank you to Ennahda and Inga, who have been the brains and driving force behind today's events. And with that, I would like to hand over to our next speaker.
John, thank you so much. I'm back on. Apologies for the technical issues. This is the new era. So I would just like to quickly jump back into some tiny little housekeeping issues. Again, we are very keen on audience engagement today. So on behalf of my colleagues, I will thank you for your time and forthcoming questions you'll have for each of our panelists to make for a very lively discussion. After, of course, Mr. George Hodgson, the FCDO's head of North Africa Joint Unit, after he presents and provides a keynote speech, we will turn it over to our 3 panel discussions today. But just a reminder that this whole event is live. We are on the record and we're streaming live on the War Studies Department YouTube channel. Please feel free to engage with the conference using social media, Facebook or Twitter. It's hashtag KCL Middle East 2020 and @King's Middle East Twitter handle. For those of you who have joined us on Zoom, we will be taking questions after each panel using the Q&A function. That's enough of the housekeeping, and now we want to get down to business. I would like to turn it over to our 2020 Institute of Middle Eastern Studies annual conference, our guest of honor and keynote speaker, the Honorable Mr. George Hodgson, the head of North Africa Joint Unit at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Prior to this post, Mr. Hodgson was the ambassador to Senegal and non-resident ambassador to Cabo Verde and Guinea-Bissau, and has held a distinguished 18-year career as a British diplomat. Director Hodgson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ennahda. Can I just check? Can you hear me? Thumbs up if you can. No?
No.
Thumbs up? I've got a thumbs up message from somebody. Can you hear me, Ennahda? Fantastic. Yeah. Okay, look, listen, I'm delighted to be here. Ennahda, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks and really well done for organising this, particularly on top of the research that I know keeps you so busy. And I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic conference. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Jonathan Hill's leadership of the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies and his expertise on the politics and security issues in the Maghreb, and I wonder whether on the back of this, Professor Hill, you might think about renaming the centre the Institute for Middle Eastern and North African Studies. Clearly, North Africa is close to your heart. Look, it's an honour to be here today, and this is going to be a really fascinating morning, and I'm delighted that a number of my colleagues from FCDO will be joining to listen to many of the discussions through the course of the morning. it's really important for government to be involved in events like this, because for us, basing our policy on robust research and real understanding of the issues is absolutely essential. And we do that in a number of ways. Obviously, we have our excellent cadre of research analysts, and I know that they have a close relationship with you and with other academics at King's, and we've drawn on your understanding of the region's economic, political and religious dynamics to inform our policy making. And I want to thank you for sharing your insights with us, but also to ask you to keep doing so. I'm going to say a word about North Africa, what we see as the opportunities and some of the challenges in and for North Africa, and what HMG, what the British government is doing about them, working with our North African partners. But first, perhaps a word about North Africa. And clearly, like you here today, and like many others, we think about North Africa as a region, acknowledging the important cultural and historical links between North African countries and much that geography gives them in common. But we also recognize the importance that North African countries place on their wider relationships and geographical linkages, particularly those that run across into the Middle East, but also down into sub-Saharan Africa and up into the Mediterranean. And we try to look at North Africa through those different prisms too. So, for example, earlier this year in January, the Prime Minister hosted the Africa Investment Summit here in London, and that took a consciously whole of Africa approach, and we were delighted that President Sisi gave the keynote address to that conference as chair in office of the African Union, but also that we had very high level participation from other North African countries. When we think about Libya, for example, clearly we're also following closely what's happening in the broader Eastern Mediterranean. And then as far as the Middle East and North Africa is concerned, well, I sit in the FCDO's Middle East and North Africa Directorate. So those linkages are sort of, if you like, geographically baked into how we organize ourselves. Nonetheless, the focus of my remarks today is on North Africa. So what do we see when we look at North Africa? I mean, first of all, I would say that we see a region of strategic importance to the UK at the intersection of the various spaces, geographical spaces that I've just described, with a population of just over 200 million, but growing significantly and right on Europe's doorstep. And as I'll note later in these remarks, the UK's interest in and commitment to North Africa has grown significantly in recent years. So we see a region of strategic importance. We also see a region of opportunity and of scope for stronger, more productive partnerships with the UK. And I just want to talk a little bit about where we see particular opportunity there. So trade and investment is clearly an important part of that story. British business invests heavily in the region. So for example, in Egypt, there are more than 1,500 British companies registered, and British firms are amongst the largest sources of foreign direct investment in Egypt, worth something like $17 billion in 2019. And trade in goods between the UK and North African countries is balanced, and there's enormous scope to increase this. We've recently signed trade agreements with Tunisia and Morocco to ensure trade continuity after the transition period following Brexit. And we're working towards an agreement with Egypt and arrangements with Algeria to ensure continuity there too. And in each of these cases, we see the agreement as a platform for deeper trade, economic and investment relationships in future, making the most of the complementarity between our economies. We also see real opportunity to work together on climate change as we look to COP26, which of course the UK will be hosting together with Italy. And we're working with our partners across North Africa to develop options for low carbon development, clean energy, economic diversification, and greater resilience in the face of oil price volatility. And so there, for example, together with the World Bank, we're supporting Egypt to implement energy subsidy reform. the UK's Commonwealth Development Corporation, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, but effectively a private sector capitalised by HM government and investing for development impact, is investing $97 million in the Nubian Sun solar energy project that will help Egypt towards its green energy targets. Egypt just issued its debut green bond last week, which is the largest green bond issuance in the MENA region so far, and the first to cross list in London. Morocco in 2020 has issued 5 green bonds worth over $400 million, and HMG is working with the Moroccan Capital Markets Authority to support further green bond listings ahead of COP26. So I think there's a lot happening already in the space of climate change, energy transition, and there's clearly much more that we can do with our partners in North Africa and that we want to do. We also see opportunities for far greater people-to-people and cultural links. North Africa is already, for example, a major destination for British tourists. Clearly, COVID has dampened that significantly. But before COVID, we had something like 750,000 Brits visiting Morocco every year, at least 400,000 visiting Egypt, and about 200,000 visiting Tunisia. And there's real potential for that to grow across the piece, as I say, once we get through this difficult COVID period, which is limiting international travel. We have strong educational links across the region. We've invested in education both bilaterally and through multilateral partners, including supporting key education reforms in Algeria and Egypt, where the UK's support to the Egyptian Ministry of Education for sectoral reform has been instrumental in unlocking a $500 million World Bank loan and a teacher training program supported by USAID. And we've also been one of the few donors to provide assistance on education in North Sinai, supporting 550 schools there. But beyond that, British education is evident, certainly in the travels that I've had around the region, that British education is much in demand, with British schools opening in Algeria and Morocco and British university campuses in Egypt. And the UK's established higher education commissions with Tunisia and Morocco to expand our collaboration in this sector. The number of students from North Africa, and I'm conscious that we may have some of them joining this session here today, is still clearly well below potential. Excellent quality, I'm sure, but the numbers are far fewer than we would want. So we've only got something like an estimated 750 students a year studying in the UK from Morocco, which compares to something like 50,000 a year that are going to French universities. And one of the things we've noticed is that helping students to improve their English is key to giving them access to British education at both secondary and tertiary level. And again, palpable in the travels that I've made in North Africa, that the appetite for English is really there. So, for example, the British Council's been working with the Tunisian government on reforming the teaching of English across the state system, including introducing English earlier in primary schools. And the British Council, again, is helping something like almost 200,000 young North Africans to sit for UK qualifications each year. So there's a lot happening here. But again, I think the potential is absolutely massive. So in these areas and many others, we see huge potential in our relationships across North Africa. But at the same time, we recognize the significant challenges that North African countries face, in many cases, as around the world, exacerbated by COVID-19. And we're acutely conscious of the impact on the UK and our interests that these challenges pose, from terrorism to irregular migration to a conflict in Libya that has blighted the lives of Libyans, created serious problems for neighboring countries, and sucked in a wider range of international actors in dangerous ways. So your conference today will look at some of the structural issues, some of these challenges facing North Africa, albeit, as Ennahda noted at the beginning, in different measure for the different countries and manifested in different ways. But some of the challenges that we're looking at are the challenges associated with demography, with demographic shifts often combining with environmental stresses that together pose a range of risks if not well managed. And so clearly, I talked about the potential earlier on of the region's population, and I think that sort of growing youth does offer real potential for a demographic dividend for North Africa. But of course, education and job creation need to keep pace, and the knock-on effects of urbanization and migration will need careful management. We're also conscious of the risks of political and economic systems that can privilege some and leave others out, and particular risks here for borderland communities and ethnic minorities. We're conscious of the risks presented by violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms, both historical and current. And of course, we're conscious of the risks presented by transnational threats, extremism, organized crime, irregular migration, that often add to instability, interacting with the factors I've just mentioned. And as we saw 10 years ago now, almost, injustice, inequality, and limited life choices can be a volatile and often dangerous mix. But I don't want to be, I want this to be kind of positive and to focus on opportunities. And I want to underline here the impressive resilience shown by North Africa. So, for example, 10 years on from the first events of the Arab Spring, Tunisia has sustained its democratic transition. Morocco has instituted important parliamentary, justice sector, education and economic reforms. Algeria's weekly Hirak protests last year contributed to a political transition whilst remaining resolutely peaceful. And I was out in Algiers towards the end of last year and then again at the beginning of this year. And it was very clear to me that on all sides there was a real commitment to keep that, to make sure that whatever happened, both on the part of the authorities and on the part of the protesters, that these remain peaceful. And over the last 5 years, Egypt has completed an economic reform program in cooperation with the IMF, which has helped to stabilize the economy and boost international confidence in doing business in Egypt. And so, for example, the green bonds issued by Egypt last week that I mentioned earlier were 5 times oversubscribed, which I think is a really positive sign. So on then to HM government and our role. I think our challenge then as a country with serious interest in North Africa is to identify how best to tackle the drivers of instability that I've just mentioned, and how to build the resilience of our partners in the region. And these are really big questions, clearly. One of the important tools we have in responding to them is the North Africa Good Governance Fund, which is run by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And I talked about our growing interest in North Africa earlier on, and I think that's manifested in part in what I'm about to say, because the North Africa Good Governance Fund has grown 8-fold over the last 5 years, from £7 million a year in 2015 to nearly £60 million a year this year. And it's doing all sorts of useful things, promoting inclusive economic development, education, inclusive government and stability. And we're working with a wide range of partners, obviously host governments, but also civil society and multilateral organizations, and indeed UK partners like the British Council. And we've seen some really excellent results. So, for example, in Egypt, through this fund, we've helped to extend social security from 1.9 to 2.5 million households. And that clearly is an important complement to the work that the Egyptian government has done with the IMF on economic reform. In Tunisia, we've supported over 100 new businesses projected to create over 1,600 new jobs through work on incubation and support to entrepreneurs. In Algeria and in Morocco, we've worked on teacher training. So in Algeria, we've helped to train 125,000 newly qualified teachers under a new training curriculum, and nearly 48,000 teachers in Morocco. In Libya, clearly the challenges are quite specific. And we've been doing a lot of work across the piece on the political side, but through programming, we have helped to establish peace-building mechanisms in 40 communities across Libya. And we funded one of the only sources of trustworthy and biased news there, which reaches 100 million Libyans. And in Tunisia, we've contributed to a new civil service strategy, and that was instrumental in helping Tunisia to access a stalled $2.9 billion IMF loan agreement. And the reason I pick out these examples of many others is that what they have in common is a recognition that £60 million a year in UK development assistance is not by itself going to affect major change in North Africa. So the key point here is that our interventions are designed to catalyse or to support bigger efforts, clearly by the governments themselves, by civil society, or by international partners and donors. And I think, as an aside, that recognition that we need properly to combine development cooperation and diplomacy if we're to have maximum impact that's what informs the creation of the new Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. But getting this right, as I said at the beginning, is hard, and it requires proper reflection and analysis and a solid evidence base. And that's where all of you come in helping us at a macro level to frame our overall international approach. And as you'll know, we have the integrated review, which is currently underway, which will define the UK's ambition, strategic objectives, and the approach and capabilities required to deliver them over the next 10 years, which situates North Africa in a broader context. But also, we're looking for your help in continue to contribute to the detailed regional and country by country cross-government analysis that we're doing of conflict and stability that underlies all of our work in North Africa. So thank you very much for all that you've shared so far. Please keep doing it. And I wish you a very fruitful discussion today. Thank you.
So thank you very much, George. I think this was an interesting keynote overall and definitely a great start to our conference. We are now moving to our first panel. Just to reiterate, however, we have 3 panels lined up for our conference day. So the first panel at 10:30 will be broadly addressing political Islam. The second panel, which will start at 1 p.m., will be addressing grassroots movements and religious voices looking to create peaceful initiatives. And then we have the third and final panel, which will start at 3 p.m. And this will address the trans-regional threats and challenges, including links to sub-Saharan Africa, which our keynote speaker has already emphasized as well. So just quickly, moving to our first panel, it's about political Islam in North Africa, which is a very broad topic, but I'm quite excited because we have a great chair lined up, Dr. Katerina Dalacoura from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And then we have 3 speakers approaching the topic from 3 different angles. And overall, I'm happy to hand over to Katerina Dalacoura, who I think is ready to chair the panel. And we are running early. We have 1 minute left until the panel is supposed to start, but I mean, I'm glad we don't have any technical glitches, etc. So I'm happy to have panel 1 start.
Good morning, everybody. Very happy to see so many of you joining us virtually for this excellent meeting, what I'm sure will turn out to be an excellent meeting. I have been asked to chair the first panel, which is, as Inga said, on political Islam across North Africa. And there is an interesting subtitle to this panel, Withered to Irrelevance or Continuous Influencer. So the dilemma that, we are tasked to explore is whether the post-Arab uprising spate of opportunities that the Islamist movements in North Africa faced has actually come to pass. To what degree has the accelerated set of developments, political developments in each of the North African countries opened up possibilities for the change and adaptability and in fact the implementation of many of the Islamist movement's programs that had thus far been a theoretical proposal as opposed to a real program. Now, going back to the momentous events of 2010, 2011, of course, it is no secret that it is a well-known fact that these events came or took the region by surprise. It was an unexpected set of developments starting in Tunisia, but also affecting each and every of the North African countries. Now, what I want to emphasize, and I'm not going to take too long in my remarks introducing the panel, is the sheer diversity of the Islamist experiences, if we can call it that, across North Africa. Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, they could not be more different in how they reacted to the initial shock of the uprisings. And specifically talking about Islamist movements within each of these contexts, we see, again, great variation and both in the original movements and in the responses to events. So this is what the 3 papers on the panel will be exploring in different ways and looking at different countries and looking at different aspects of these Islamist political developments. The overall sense, and this is captured in the description of our panel, is that the expectation that Islamist movements will capture the political moment, that they will be able to dominate perhaps in the context created by the overthrow of some of the regimes of North Africa, that this expectation has not actually come to pass. And we see in the case of Egypt, but also in the case of Tunisia, possibly Libya as well, a very rapid backtracking, a very rapid receding of what was meant to be the Islamist political moment. Why has this happened? Is it to do with perhaps a tension between the expectations that the populations, the citizenry of these countries had about how Islamist movements would behave and the actual reality of gaining power and trying to sort of put your ideas in practice? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Alexis Blouet is a postdoctoral research fellow at Al Walid Center in the University of Edinburgh. And he works with Frederick Volpe on a comparative approach to analyzing Islamist parties' action in governance around the Mediterranean region. Now, Alexis is going to discuss his paper for about 10-15 minutes. This is how long each of the paper givers will have to expand and express their core ideas of their papers. And I've been asked by Alexis to point out that his title has changed to A Legal Perspective on Political Islam and States' Power in North Africa. So without further ado, Alexis, please start off the panel.
Hi, everyone. So I would like to thank the King's College Institute for Middle Eastern Studies for having invited me. I will put the PowerPoint for the presentation. And is it, can everyone see the presentation? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, so I will start the PowerPoint. So thanks a lot again for the King's College Institute for Middle Eastern Study for having invited me. In fact, yeah, the title of the presentation is slightly different from the title which was put on the presentation of the conference. I've tried to broaden a bit the scope, but in terms of content, it will be a bit similar. So I wanted to say that, as Katerina said, like the Arab Spring, I meant the access to position of state power for Islamist parties all over North Africa, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Egypt, even if it was for a short moment, this party have access position of state power. And so the main literature on political Islam hasn't really changed. The question remains the same, like, what is their ideology, what is their party organization, and this new configuration sets opportunity to ask questions about their policy making. And as I'm thinking that like law is a modern form of policy making and of legitimizing policy making, maybe perhaps legal theory, how to say something to us about what is this policy proposal of Islamist political parties? How can we conceptualize them? How can we think about their impact? How can we think about the politics of policy making from political Islam parties? I'm going to look at that, looking at a policy proposal tied to the Islamic normative traditions. So what I mean by Islamic normative tradition is like either very kind of vague and broad ideas about politics, like for instance, reference to compliance with Sharia. It means also institutions of authority, of normative authorities like ulema, or and it also means like, it can also refer to social areas which are traditionally or which have been traditionally regulated by like Islamic related thinking, such as family. So in legal theory, there is like a very broad distinction between rules and principles. So in legal system, you have norms. In a modern legal system, you have norms, and you can distinguish norms by saying either they're rules or principles. So it's initially a matter of precision towards expected behavior of the individual, which is targeted by the norm. If the norm is prescribing directly a behavior, you could say it's a rule. But a principle is more, I would say, vague, or but in reality, the empirical function of a principle is a justifying function. Principle exists in legal system, or they could be said as existing in legal system by providing argumentative resource to ground claims about rules validity, to say that this rule is valid or this rule is valid. So that's what we could say about principles. So if you look at the Article 1 of the Tunisian constitution, of the current Tunisian constitution, which refers to Islam as being a state religion, you can understand the debate that existed within the Constituent Assembly after the Arab Spring about this article. So the fear was that this article would bring a very specific agenda, which would bring to kind of specific way of Islamizing, but it would it was feared that it would have a vast interpretative potential, which could perhaps be used by Islamist power to virtually kind of Islamize whatever that means, all aspects of law. So if you look at the concept of rules, so more precise norm, which says more directly what should do individuals. I'm going to use here a distinction made by an English legal theorist called Herbert Hart. It distinguishes between primary rules, so which are like the rules which are at the core of a normative system, which are designed at social control, which are aimed at the population. So that are the primary rules. to the secondary rules, which makes the distinction, of like modern legal system or modern normative system, because in modern normative system, we have rules which explains and which regulates the way the normative systems rules and how it should enforce social control. So there are rules which are primary, which is the primary function of a normative system, which is, I would say, to enforce social control on the society, and secondary rules which are here to regulate the normative system or the legal system itself. So I'm going to show that the second type of rules, the secondary rules, the rule pertaining to the legal system itself, I'm going to use 3 subtypes of this type of rules, and I'm going to show how they can analyze the debates that occurred within the Egyptian Constituent Committee of 2012, which enacted the Egyptian Constitution of 2012, which is not in force currently because it has been repealed after the overthrow of Morsi, but which is known as, and it is perhaps a bit not correct, as a Muslim Brotherhood constitution, and it's more complex than that. But I'm going to show you all these categories of secondary rules and all the 3 subcategories of secondary rules can a bit enlighten the debate that occurred within this constituent committee. So one subtype of secondary rules is rules of change. So it's rules which deals with the authority to enact, modify, and repeal law, which give power to like different state body to modify the law or to have a say in how the law should be made. It referred to the debate around the Article 4 and about the power of the University of Al-Azhar in the legislative process. So it was a matter of rules of change, whether the Islamic University of Al-Azhar should have a word to say when there is lawmaking in Egypt. So you've got also a second subtypes of secondary rules, rules of adjudication. So what happens if there is a contestation about a norm violation, how we should ascertain that a norm has been violated? So you go to the judge, and the rules that should follow the judge and the way they should solve litigation are called rules of adjudication. So here it refers to an Article 82, which hinted at the fact that in case of conflict between Sharia, principles of Sharia, and individual rights, like the later might prevail, for the former might prevail, Sharia. So it's rules of adjudication, which refer to the power of the judges and what they should do when they adjudicate a litigation. And finally, the last subcategory of secondary rules are rules of recognition, which enable to identify if a norm or not belongs to the legal system, and it could be a way to understand, like the controversy which occurred within this constituent committee around the Article 219, and about the issue which could be understood as whether or not like Quran and Hadith should be directly incorporated within the Egyptian legal system. But you have also to bear in mind that secondary rules are not only about like the state and state body creating rules, because also individuals, we can enact rules on each other, for instance, by making contracts or by making will, by dealing with succession. That's all the matter of private law, and all the rules which are explaining to us individual how we should engage in contract, or we should engage in, for instance, succession. That is also a type of secondary rules. The primary rules are more straightforward. They are like the essential rules of legal systems. So they are aimed at the population or at the society. So they are made by 2 components. There is a prescription and there is a sanction. So for instance, if there is a rules which prescribe that there could be a rule which prescribes that if you kill someone, you will go to jail for life. So there is a prescription. So don't kill anyone. And the sanction, if you kill, you will go to jail for life. So that's a kind of primary rules. These rules set obligation on individuals. So if you take the example of the AKP Erdogan party in Turkey, like their Islamic policy or their policy which are tied to Islamic normative traditions, have added more obligations, for instance, like on entrepreneur regarding the sale of alcohol. They have not obligated to not sell alcohol too late or not sell alcohol near mosque, for instance. But it has also set less obligation, and in this way we could say it has given rights, for instance, to women to wear headscarves in public institutions. So this categorization is not only about how we could statically classify norms. I want to say that this legal categories can also help policy dynamics and basically all these Islamist parties can engage in compromise as part within policy making. So I'm gonna here focus on Ennahda, which has been since its arrival in power in 2011, always in coalition, in a position of power sharing. So we will see here that they've engaged in compromise proposal, or they adopted a compromise posture whereby they would ask for the maintenance within the legal system of Islamic inspired primary rules, but they would make concession to their political opponents or adversaries by proposing to add principal or secondary rules which would jeopardize the force of these primary rules. So that's the way they could make compromise. So my first example is a debate that occurred within the Constituent Assembly, which lasted from 2012 to 2014. So death penalty is a sanctions component of many crimes in Tunisian law. It could be tied to Islamic normative tradition, and even if it's not a monopoly of this Islamic normative tradition, because it's mentioned into it with very specific evidence and with very specific like infraction in crimes, but it's mentioned into it. But what matters also is that Ennahda has justified the fact that it wants the maintenance of death penalty, not only, but it has done it because of its tie to the normative tradition. So what with Islamic normative tradition? So within the Constituent Assembly, there were people which were for the abolition, and Ennahda was against to write the abolition. So they compromised by saying that by written like an article on the right to life, which is the Article 22. So the right to life is not directly about abolition of death penalty. It's a principle, it's a bit vague. It could mean almost anything. But here you can see it as, well, Ennahda adds maintenance of the death penalty within the legal system, but by adding principles, they gave an argumentative resources for abolitionists if they want to press for abolition later. So it's a kind of gamble. It's a kind of a gamble involving the future political configuration. And my last example is the issue of women in succession law. So in Tunisian family law, there is a rules which says that people enforcing succession, so people which spread the share of a family member once he passes away, it says that this person should give the sons twice more than the daughters in the succession. So this rule has been controversial, and there has been like a process to abolish it from the Tunisian normative system. And Ennahda was against, notably because it was like a rule which is tied to the Islamic normative tradition. So they supported the maintenance, but they accepted, like they hinted that they were ready to make a compromise by adding a kind of secondary rule, giving individuals the ability to depart from this rule in a will. They said, okay, we want to maintain like this kind of rule that sons should have twice more than the daughter in the law, but we want to change secondary rules, and by giving power to individual in a will to modify this rule. So by empowering people to go over the state's authority by specifying in a will that, for instance, they would share equally their properties between their sons and daughter. So here we can say that they pushed for the maintenance of a primary Islamic normative, rule tied to the Islamic normative tradition, but proposed to make a compromise by adding a secondary rule which could give the opportunity to circumvent it. So on a conclusion, I want to make broad remarks about like the relation between Islamic normative tradition and state's law, and which relates to some concern which exists in the Middle East about like the so-called Islamization that would mean like the arrival of Islamic parties in power. So the issue is not so much about what Islamic normative tradition does to state law, but it's rather how state law reshapes and dilutes Islamic normative tradition. So I would like to thank everyone for having listening to me, and I hope that the talk went through well.
Thank you very much, Alexis. We have a frozen screen here.
Okay. Yeah.
I will proceed anyway, and introduce our second speaker, Alice Aluni, who is an independent researcher and development consultant with an illustrious career. She holds a PhD in Government and International Affairs from Durham University and an MA from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She is working on Libya, and her paper is entitled Islam and Islamism in Libya, Reconfiguring a National Identifier. So without further ado, Alice, please, 10-15 minutes. I just wanted to, before going ahead, I just wanted to remind the audience that questions should be submitted through the Q&A. Alice.
Thank you very much, Katerina. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Well, thank you very much, first of all, to the King's College Institute for Middle Eastern Studies for the invitation. It is a great pleasure to share. I think it's the first time since when I've submitted my PhD thesis, so I'm quite excited. In this presentation, I am going to discuss about Islam and Islamism in Libya. And in particular, this paper is an excerpt of my PhD thesis. The thesis explored the relation between national belonging, everyday nationhood, and globalization in Libya. I examined how the flows of people, ideas, images, and technologies had an impact on the emergence and evolution of everyday practices of nationhood and of a sense of national belonging among a selected group of Libyan actors, the transitional political elite, the civil society, and the diaspora. So through this work, Islam was described by most research participants as a national cultural identifier. They refer to Islam as the main factor binding Libyans together. However, when delving deeper in the conversation, a tendency emerged to identify exogenous and endogenous factors, what is Libyan and what is not when it comes to Islam. Orthodox Sunni Maliki Islam was largely perceived as endogenous to the Libyan society, compatible with Sufi orders and tradition. It was seen as the core of the Libyan value structure and the framework of its social system. On the contrary, several interviewees claim that the 2011 revolution brought to the fore of the battlefield and the political and religious scene a variety of Islamist ideological currents and groups that were alien to Libyan society and to the way Libyan people practice Islam. To give you a couple of quotes, moderate Islam, said one of the participants, has always governed and has always been a part of the Libyan social fabric. Unfortunately, now we are seeing certain changes and trends and kind of new influences and new and different ideas that are alien to what Libya has always had. Another one stressed Salafism came from outside and doesn't have roots or sheikhs in Libya. They still get fatwas from Saudi Arabia or Jordan, and that means it doesn't exist in Libyan society. But we can find graveyards of Sufi sheikhs, and still Libyan people celebrate religious Eid in the Sufi way. You find, for example, Sufi from Jaqboub on the Egyptian border, and from places like Zuwara on the coast. You find it in Kufra and Ghat as well. To understand and contextualize these claims, I provide a brief historical analysis on the rise of Islamism in Libya and then focus on the events witnessed after 2011 that contributed to challenge the role of Islam as a unifying national cultural identifier. So Islam was one of the main pillars of Muammar Gaddafi's vision of the Libyan nation. He emphasized the centrality of the Quran to Islam and criticized the Hadith on the grounds that the Quran is the only real source of God's word. But he also criticized the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, rejecting their former interpretations for being the product of a struggle for political power, while mosques should be places of worship and not arenas to discuss economic, social, or political questions. Starting in the late 1970s, the regime subordinated religion to the state and engaged in an open confrontation with Islamist groups inside the country that were repressed and forced into exile. So today I'll focus on two movements, the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafism. So the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood first appeared in Libya in the 1950s through the Egyptian members of the movement who fled the persecution of Gamal Abdel Nasser, but also through Egyptian teachers that were working in Libya and Libyan students who had studied in Egypt. However, the movement did not thrive at the time, mainly due to the resistance of the political elite and religious elite that fostered a form of traditional Islam and the role of the tribe as the main form of social organization. In the late 1970s, after the rise to power of Muammar Gaddafi and the repression and security operations by the regime against the leadership of the movement, the members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Libya started to leave the country. The Libyan Islamic group was funded as the Libyan branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1979 in the US and the UK. As students and exiles, mainly in the UK, the US, and Canada, the members of the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood developed the networks that are at the basis of today's organizational structure. Throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, those brotherhood figures who had remained inside the country opted instead for a gradual social approach. But due to regime's repression, they did not manage to create the charities and the social networks that were necessary to draw support to the movement, preventing it from gaining a strong foothold in Libya. When in 1998, the regime discovered some Muslim Brotherhood cells in the country, it launched a mass arrest campaign that led to over 100 members detained and the rest forced to flee. However, in the 2000s, in search for new allies, the Gaddafi regime opened a dialogue with the Muslim Brotherhood. And these led to the release in 2006 of members of the group and to the return of some of them from abroad, based on a pledge not to engage in political activities. At the onset of the revolution in 2011, the movement remained banned in Libya and its members were closely monitored, making of it little more than a movement in exile and limiting the ability of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology to take root beyond the intelligentsia. When looking at Salafism, understood as a political outlook which seeks to revive the practices of the first three generations of Islam, seen as a golden age of authenticated and orthodox Islam, Salafism first reached Libya in the 1970s through the taped cassettes of Wahhabi preachers and Libyans who traveled to Saudi Arabia for Hajj and escaped in so doing the regime's censorship of books, newspapers, and foreign media that existed at the time in Libya. In particular, Madkhali Salafism is a current of Salafism that calls for the emulation of the pious ancestors and opposes political participation. That appeared in Libya in the 1990s through the support of Saudi religious charities, satellite television, and through Libyan people who had studied in Saudi Arabia and in Yemen in Markali-linked institutions, or had been exposed to this type of Salafism during pilgrimage in Mecca and Medina. Ideologically, Markalism is opposed to the Maliki school of jurisprudence. Although initially suspicious, the regime in fact allowed for the movement to grow and invited Markali scholars in Libya in the 2000s as they preached against political dissent. And so this was very functional to the regime's survival. Books and taped sermons from Saudi Arabia were allowed to flow into the country, but it was really in the 2000s with satellite television and the internet that the doctrine picked up in Libya. And also, thanks to the support of Gaddafi's son Sadi, Salafi Markali preachers, they took control of mosques and provided Quranic classes. So this brief historical account showed that, in fact, Islamism is neither alien nor entirely new to Libya. The year 2000s, in particular, were a decade of opening by the regime that prompted the emergence of Islamism in the public space in Libya. However, these claims that I've introduced at the beginning of this presentation, in fact, reflect a largely shared perception that a huge number of Libyans from the Islamist diaspora came back during and after the 2011 revolution, infiltrating Libyan transitional institutions and the battlefield. So with the 2011 revolution and the collapse of the regime, Islamist movements found new space in the political and security landscape inside the country. There are several instances of the relation between the flow of returnees from the Islamist diaspora and more conservative and radical forms of Islam's emerging in Libya. I'll start with the Muslim Brotherhood. Leaders of the movement like Imad al-Banani and Abdelrazak al-Aradi had returned to Libya before 2011. However, the return of members of the MB became more evident in 2011 with leaders and members of the Brotherhood joining the ranks of the National Transitional Council that was the political organ of the revolution. And they demanded that the National Transitional Council be diverse and representative of the Islamist strands of Libyan society. In one of their first actions, members of the Muslim Brotherhood, together with the Salafist faction outside the National Transitional Council, demonstrated against the reference to Sharia law as a main source of legislation in a draft of the constitutional roadmap, and succeeded in modifying it into the main source of legislation. Commentators at the time observed that the National Transitional Council roadmap did not reflect the position of Libyans on the issue of Sharia. Public opinion surveys in 2013 reported that a majority of Libyans wanted Sharia to be a source of legislation, but not the main source of legislation. Moving on to Salafi Markalism, at the beginning of the revolution, Salafi Markali preachers encouraged their followers to side with the regime. But during the take of Tripoli in August 2011, they took up weapons and sided with the revolutionaries. In the aftermath of the revolution, they took advantage of the absence of state authority to proselytize, take control of mosques, clamp down on the sale of alcohol, demolish Sufi shrines, tombs, and mosques, while establishing a presence within armed groups and paramilitary structures. In so doing, Salafists gained control of the streets and worked toward imposing new social norms on Libyan people. Some interviewees observed that as a result of the rise of Salafism, men in Libya today go more often to the mosque, they dress differently, they wear a beard, while women experience unprecedented restrictions on their freedom of movement. Salafists wanted people to stop celebrating a religious festivity, the Prophet's birthday, Mawlid, which is a big festivity in Libya, and is considered haram by Salafists. People defied them, however, and celebrated the festivity to reaffirm their religious practices and religious identity. Today, Markalis own schools and religious academies where they give lessons and hold seminars, inviting sheikhs from Saudi Arabia. What does this brief presentation tell us? Well, first of all, Islamism in its different forms can hardly be described as new or exogenous to Libyan society. But what really changed during and after 2011 was the reach and the ability of these ideas and groups to circulate unchecked inside Libya. that was unprecedented and offered the opportunity for those coming from exile to join their peers in Libya. Indeed, while Sunni Maliki Islam and Sufism have a centuries-old tradition in North Africa and in Libya, one cannot ignore the emergence of Islamist current and groups in Libya in the late 20th century that, as much as in the rest of the world, gained support among some sections of the population. At the same time as Islamism of the Muslim Brotherhood or Salafism or Salafi jihadism gained momentum as global ideologies and movements, they also emerged in Libya. And it was the regime repression that provided an obstacle to the spreading of this ideology, but also created the conditions for these to develop underground or in exile, or in the case of Salafi Markalism in open sight in Libya in the 2000s. When global and local links were recomposed in 2011, these ideologies were able to emerge, challenging moderate Islam and its role in the society, the way people practice the faith and live their everyday lives. After 2011, Islam acquired a whole new connotation in the everyday life of individuals. It became a polarizing and divisive factor exploited by political forces, calling into question the role of Islam as a unifying national identifier. Islamism challenged the unity of the Libyan nation and their understanding of Islam as a unifying factor on the basis of different interpretation and understanding of Islamic beliefs and practices. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you very much, Alice. I will now invite Guy Eyre to discuss his paper. Guy is a final year doctoral research fellow and candidate in the Department of Politics and IR at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And he works on Salafi ideational politics in Morocco and Algeria. His paper is called Divine Paths to Politics, Salafism, Islamism, and the State in Morocco and Algeria. So without further ado, Guy, please.
Thank you very much for having me. Let me just share my screen. Great, cool. So yeah, thank you very much to Inga, Nagar, Aisha, and also Dr. Jonathan Hill for the invitation. So this presentation is based on 2 years of doctoral research, which looks at the politics of quietist, purportedly pre-political Salafi groups in Morocco in particular. And so I'm using sort of discourse analysis of a large tranche of Salafi literature, local media sources, and interviews and participant observation with Salafi actors. And I want to use these very few minutes briefly to assess some important shifts and changes in the Salafi landscape in Morocco in recent years, and to identify some important reasons for these interesting shifts. And then finally, I want to briefly consider what this all means when thinking about the relevance and influence of Salafism in Morocco today. So, my framing question really is, has Salafi activism in Morocco shifted in recent years, particularly since the 2011-12 20th February protests? And how have Salafi groups, particularly quietist groups, in many ways the heart of the Salafi movement in Morocco, contended with these events and the emergence of popular power? Very, very briefly, as you've heard, we have this idea of a modern purist Salafism as being a sort of scripturalist, literalist, transnational Sunni Islamic movement centered on a particular conception of tawhid or monotheism, stressing a return to the authentic beliefs and practices of the first 3 generations of Muslims, and the predominance of quietism over other Salafi trends appeared to wane since 2011 and 12 as Salafi groups across the MENA region departed from this erstwhile quietism, entering formal politics and forming political parties and so on and so forth. So by way of a very brief sort of historical background to Salafism in Morocco, a sort of modern purist Wahhabi inspired Salafi trend in Morocco slowly metamorphoses into a sort of movement centered on Marrakesh in the 1970s, driven by the activism of Mohammed Abdurrahman al-Maghrawi, pictured here. He establishes the Association for the Quranic Call and the Sunnah, popularly referred to as Dur al-Quran, in 1976. And Dur al-Quran, his association, is paradigmatic of this more quietist, scholastic Salafi trend. Right? Dur al-Quran's activities are centered on Islamic education and the purification of Islam from so-called innovations or bid'ah. Now, Maghrawi argues in this period that party politics and protest and political participation are haram, are forbidden, and he's highly critical of his pro-Islamic competitors, particularly the PJD. And in this period, from the late 70s through to about the early 2000s, the Mahzan, the palace-oriented political establishment, considered Maghrawi and Salafis more generally in the country to be a broadly pro-status quo trend in confronting new domestic challenges from the Islamist sector and from leftist threats. And so consequently, Salafis like Maghrawi enjoy considerable latitude to utilize mosques and associations to spread their ideas. This then changes in 2003 with the 2003 bombings in Casablanca perpetrated by Salafi jihadi networks. A widespread crackdown ensues with the arrest and sentencing of approximately 1,500 people for their alleged roles in the attacks, and the closure also of many Salafi networks. The regime attempts to restrict what it perceived as the influence of Saudi Wahhabi trends in the country, including by closing Dur al-Quran centers in Marrakesh in 2003, and then its headquarters in 2008, following a controversial fatwa by Sheikh Maghrawi himself. So this period marks an end to Dur al-Quran's cooperative coexistence with the regime, and this is very important for thinking about shifts, I think, in Salafi dynamics post-2011. Maghrawi and his family flee to Saudi Arabia in 2008, where they remained in voluntary exile until 2011. And I want to argue that this is an important period in the evolution of quieter Salafism in Morocco. That as Maghrawi remained in Saudi Arabia from 2008, a new, younger generation of more reformist and critical Salafi scholars within Dur al-Quran, including Hamad al-Qabbaj, became prominent within the Salafi organization. And these younger Salafi figures, they developed new, more legalistic practices of contesting the state's closures, including by directing a lawsuit against a state ministry. I also argue that this pre-2011 period, pre-2011 period, we see signs of informal relationships between Dur al-Quran and political parties. There's reason to think that figures from the Istiqlal party helped to sign off licenses for new Dur al-Quran branches in return for Maghrawi's support. And certainly by 2008, Hamid al-Qabbaj and the other young Salafis within Dur al-Quran established contact with the Party of Justice and Development, and who call for the reopening of Dur al-Quran on Dur al-Quran's behalf. In short, Dur al-Quran's political arrangements with political parties, offering support in local and elections in return for institutional favors, has something of a history in Morocco. This then takes us to the third and most recent phase of Salafi dynamics in Morocco, following the 20th February protest movement that erupts in the country in 2011. It involved large numbers of young Moroccans, including many members and sympathizers of the Islamist Justice and Spirituality Party, who, together with members of leftist groups, who gather across urban centers in the country, taking to the streets and calling for substantive political and economic reform. The monarchy retakes control of the reform agenda. And this is important because then amidst these protests and these initial openings, the Joint Committee for the Defense of Islamic Detainees is established. It's established out of an informal network of mothers and wives of alleged Salafi jihadi detainees and released Salafi ex-jihadis. And they engage in petitions and protests calling for the release of these prisoners, sentenced for their alleged roles in the 2003 Casablanca bombings. The regime also, pictured here, releases prominent imprisoned Salafi ex-jihadi preachers, who some of them go on to then engage in formal politics, joining minor political parties, or attempting unsuccessfully to establish their own political parties. And this is important, right? So whilst they do join the political game, they do it within the regime's red lines. They're not allowed to join, they're only allowed to join minor, broadly pro-palace political parties in small groups. They're not allowed to join the larger pro-Islamic PJD party, nor to establish Salafi political party themselves. Within this context, we also then start to see the emergence of a new, increasingly politicized or reformist group within Dawr al-Quran, again centered on the young Hamad al-Qabash. He argues in 2011 and 12 that one can benefit from some of democracy's procedures, for example, elections, voting in parliament. And he also argues that protests are a legitimate means of effecting reform on certain conditions. Maghrawi himself also writes an introduction supporting many of Qabaj's new ideas. And it's in this context that Maghrawi suddenly disavows his historical rejection of protest as impermissible and prone to facilitate fitna. And Maghrawi's public attitudes towards other Islamist groups, particularly the PJD, also become more positive and conciliatory. And Maghrawi urges people to vote for the PJD party in the 2011 legislative elections. This leads to the regime opening some of Dawr al-Quran's previously shut centers. However, by early 2013, this growing alliance between Dawr al-Quran and the PJD and Maghrawi's support for the PJD in the 2011 parliamentary elections, together with al-Qabaj's increasingly politicized writings, sees the Interior Ministry again react punitively, and it shuts all of Dawr al-Quran's centers. And then it's within this context that we see a split within Dawr al-Quran. The increasingly politicized Hamad al-Qabaj and his supporters leave Dawr al-Quran over a dispute regarding Maghrawi's position about Saudi Arabia and the Saudi Arabian monarch's position on the recent 2013 coup in Egypt. And so Qabaj and Rafouche go on to establish a rival, more politicized Salafi organization in Marrakesh. And with the collapse of Maghrawi-PJD relations, the PJD leadership by 2016 choose al-Qabaj himself as a PJD candidate for the 2016 parliamentary elections, as you can see in this photo here. However, the Ministry of Interior rejects Qabaj's candidacy. By 2016, repeating his dalliance with party politics after 2012, Maghrawi then forges a secret alliance, not with the PJD, but with the Party of Authenticity and Modernity. This is a fiercely pro-palace party, and he does so in return for the party's support for the reopening of Dawr al-Quran centers. And within this context, Qabaj goes on to become a key part of a broader Salafi network in Morocco, composed of Salafi scholars, pro-Islamic civil society actors, and very close to a Salafi-leaning press in Morocco. And Qabaj has gone on to become more outspoken on a range of social and political issues. He increasingly articulates a sort of patriotic national Moroccan Salafism, which he maintains is compatible with the Malikism of official Moroccan Islam, and different, he argues, from the Wahhabi Saudi Salafism of his former mentor, Maghrawi. So in this way, Qabaj in recent years has worked quite practically to attempt to reconcile his Salafism and Salafi identity with state-sanctioned Islam, itself tied and intertwined to Moroccan nationalism. So in the final minute or two, I just wanted to spend, reflect briefly on how we can make sense of some of these very interesting kind of shifts in Salafi dynamics in Morocco in recent years. Now, clearly external and political context and political opportunities and costs played a key role in shifting Salafi discourse, reasoning and activism between 2003 and 2013. The new political openings of 2011, following the mass protests, meant that Maghrawi could engage in some, albeit limited, political participation to help push for Dawr al-Quran's reopening within the regime's red lines forbidding the establishment of a Salafi political party and requiring Maghrawi support for the Mahsan's reformist agenda, the regime's reformist agenda. Maghrawi's new discursive orientation regarding concepts of political participation and voting and also political cooperation with the PJD was, I think, largely instrumental. He sought to secure dawah activities and the survival of his Salafi association by exchanging Salafi votes for the PJD's support in coaxing the regime to reopen Dawr al-Quran centers. Maghrawi, however, was also cognizant of the costs, as it were, of not engaging in formal politics, allowing what he saw as secular and heterodox Islamic forces to increase their influence in the country. And so whilst it wanted Maghrawi to support a pro-palace party, in 2011 and 12, the regime was also reluctant to expend too much political capital forestalling this reconciliation between Dawr al-Quran and the PJD party. Both the PJD and Dalacoura position themselves broadly against the Arab Spring, and so were important allies for a regime determined to ensure ongoing political support from Morocco's conservative social milieu. But I want to argue also briefly that there's reason to think that Maghraoui's spectacular shift in this period was also not just simply a pragmatic response to external, domestic and regional political events. The substantive ideological shift of this new generation of more explicitly politicized scholars, most notably Khabbaj, I think was substantive who substantively rethought their positions on legal protests, exposed Maghraoui to new ideas. However, these ideas and evolutions in al-Khabbaj's thinkings were, however, not accepted by many Dalacoura scholars, and not even by Maghraoui ultimately himself. However, as the regime re-established its dominance in the political system and worked to close political space, it also shut down Dalacoura because of its growing alliance with the PJD. And so the Mahsan's policy remained clear. Only small numbers of Salafis could associate with small, uninfluential political parties. I should probably stop there. I think what I will do just to flag up is there's a very kind of growing second kind of space for Salafi activism in Morocco, centered on the Joint Committee, which I discussed, evolved in 2011. And this has been involved initially in campaigning for the release of jihadi Salafi prisoners, but in recent years has stepped up its local advice-giving sit-ins and has taken on public positions on a range of issues, from the banning of the niqab and a range of other kind of sensitive issues. Looking ahead, I think it's unlikely that Salafi figures will play a major role in Moroccan formal politics. Salafi groups in Morocco are fragmented and weakened. Maghraoui has lost support because of his dalliance with politics in 2011 and 12. The more politicized trend focused on Khabbaj has also recently split. I think it's unlikely that Khabbaj will be allowed to push and compete for political office outside of a minor pro-palace party. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to try to do just for a couple of minutes is bring some unity between the three papers and perhaps raise some questions from the remarks of the three speakers. To me, what's interesting, or what is perhaps an interesting underlying sort of context in all three papers, is the societal responses to developments within Islamist movements. So we saw that in the case of Alexis' paper, who discussed the legal aspects of negotiations about future constitutional arrangements in Tunisia. And we also see it very much in Alice's paper on Libya, where she comments on how post-2011, the opportunities for Islamist movements to expand themselves and to sort of find responsiveness in the society is also having quite a combustion of a reaction, if I can call it that, in creating question marks around national identity. Finally, Guy's paper is perhaps an interesting comment on, if I may say, the insularity of the Salafi movement in the case of Morocco. And what is interesting there, I think, is the degree to which the developments, the ideological developments, are perhaps more to do with intra-Islamist or sort of negotiations and sort of discussions within movements, as opposed to within the broader context, although the political establishment is, of course, as always, present in the background in Morocco. So what I wanted to invite each of the speakers to do, perhaps, is tell us a bit more about these contexts. So in the case of Alexis first, how do you see the future of these negotiations. You touched on two very interesting cases, the death penalty and succession law. Can you broaden this out a little bit and tell us a bit more about perhaps prospects for change in the future, particularly given the interesting underlying, perhaps one could even say secularization, in the sense of perhaps a decline of religiosity in Tunisia and perhaps many other parts of North Africa. Similarly with Alice, my question is, in a situation where, well, there is civil war, there's hot conflict in Libya, how do we see perhaps the prospects for the future reunification of the nation being helped by renegotiations between the different types of Islamism at play? And finally, Guy concluded very well by saying that the prospects for the political future of the Salafis is not great, but perhaps he could expand a little bit, touching on Algeria, perhaps, which is, I know, one of his other interests, comparing with Algeria, if that is a fruitful way to go, and perhaps also touching briefly on the political context more broadly in Morocco. So just to get the conversation going, I think there's unity between the three papers, but perhaps each of the three speakers could try to answer the questions I put to them. So Alexis, perhaps first.
Thanks, Katerina. Thanks for like asking this question and trying to unify our different perspective. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to expand a bit on two parts of my presentation. So regarding the debate on death penalty and succession law in Tunisia. So regarding death penalty, I have to underline also it's a symbolic issue, since there is a moratorium on Tunisia on death penalty. So it's still there in the penal system, it's still there in the law, but it has not been carried out since 1990, and since there is a moratorium. So it's like people are still condemned to death, but it's not carried out by government. So I have to mention that. And like the discussion on abolition, I would say has been a bit changed with what like the different attacks on the presidential guard bus, on the museum of Bordeaux, because there has been like a law which is called anti-terrorist law, which has been unanimously accepted, and which has added other occurrence of death penalty for what is being legally qualified as terrorist crime. So I would say like death penalty formal abolition for me in the Tunisian legal system seems a bit far away. And regarding also succession law also, this reform, the prospect for this reform are a bit bleaker, I would say, because there has been a change in the political configuration, because the reform of succession law towards a greater equality between women and men was initiated by the former presidents, Beji Caid Essebsi, who died, who has been replaced by Kais Saied, who has like explicitly positioned against. So I would say the reform is not altered in the parliament, and I would say the political configuration and the change of president also means bleaker prospect for this reform. And I wanted to emphasize for both that like Ennahda position is not peculiar. Like there are parties which are secular, which are also against the abolition of death penalty and against the abolition of the rule discriminating men and women in succession. So it's not like a position which characterized only Ennahda. So I wanted to say that that also can lead to some question about the categories that we use between Islamist and secular, if you regard like the actual program and policy proposal. So thanks a lot for your question. I'm going to leave the floor to the other participants.
Alice?
Yes, thank you very much, Katerina, for the question. What I'm going to answer to you is that for sure, we have seen in the past in Libya, in the last 10 years, that when put in the corner, the more moderate Islamist movements, like the movement I was discussing about in my presentation, the Muslim Brotherhood, has looked for allies within, let's say, the more extreme side of the spectrum. And that has been a tendency that I think probably that the panelists will agree is not unique to Libya in that sense. And so prospects for reunification of Islamist ideology, I'm not so sure. Also, one thing we need to stress is that still, especially when it comes to Salafism, it remains very fluid. So like it's not necessarily that easy to identify groups or currents as it remains fluid. So it does in terms of the ability to sit at a table and negotiate and bring together a unified position. So that's how, I would see this. But I would add something else also to answer one of the question by Amin of the implications on attempts at trying to sanction the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood internationally, but also what would be the implication on this for the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood. So yes, I think in general, the implications of these kind of attempts are to radicalize, like send the movements underground and allow for radicalization within the movement, within the space. If not, again, thinking of the current context in Libya of civil war, kind of like reinforcing the need for weapons and reinforcing the need to maintain strong contact to armed groups, because that's what ultimately allows you to have a say in such a context. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, that's very interesting. Guy?
Yeah, thank you for your question. No, I absolutely agree that this sort of like complex, contested role of Salafi groups' internal politics and interpretations of religious ideas and concepts really played a sort of driving role, right, in shaping the contours of Salafi behavior and mobilization. So in that sense, I agree it is quite insular. I think in 2011 and 12, Maghraoui himself, whilst focused on these sort of specific ideological debates amongst different Salafi figures, was still very mindful of not being left behind by the broader sort of Salafi-leaning social base in Marrakesh and further afield. So in other words, a social base that was considerably broader than simply attendees and members of his association. But by and large, he was kind of, you're right, he was concerned on these more insular kind of factors. I think more recently, which I tried to briefly kind of point towards, Hamad al-Khabbaj, this kind of reformist figure who emerges out of the quietist Dalacoura group and then splits. I think his attempt to try and articulate an idea of a sort of patriotic, as he says, national Moroccan Salafism as being opposed and very different from the Saudi Wahhabi Salafism of Maghraoui is also an attempt to sort of not just distinguish himself within the Salafi field and the Salafi sort of landscape, but also to appeal to a much broader base, right? He has these political ambitions still. And I think he is trying to sort of make himself appeal to a broader kind of conservative, perhaps more politically minded, certainly Salafi kind of social base, but also more conservative wings, arguably, of the movement of unity and reform, the social wing of the PJD. So I think there are some of these sort of slightly less insular dynamics at play as well, but I broadly very much agree with your point. What else did I want to say? In terms of prospects, in terms of kind of looking forward, looking ahead, I think I touched on this very briefly. I could perhaps just flesh this out for another 30 seconds just to say that, I think Dalacoura and Maghraoui are in a very, very difficult position, having gone from being this very, very powerful organization with associated centers across Morocco. It's lost support both from these more politicized Salafi-leaning grassroots who gravitated towards Khabbaj, but also having lost the support of a more kind of purist Salafi rank and file, disappointed with Maghrawi's electoral sort of dalliance and political dalliance with parties in 2011 and also 2016. And certainly during my fieldwork, I think, it's very clear that Dawla al-Quran attendance levels are pretty low at the moment, and it's a real concern, a very explicit concern for the leadership of Dawla al-Quran. And Maghrawi is also in a very weak position vis-a-vis the regime too. He finds himself under pressure once again, I think, with the elections coming up next year, potentially to operate as a swing voting base by at least privately supporting, a pro-regime party in return for the continued sort of licenses and functioning of his centers from the regime. I think as a final point, just to add in, I'm also just mindful of, and this is a point that Mohammed Masbaz also mentions in a recent paper, the fact that the PJD was so dominant in Marrakesh in the 2016 elections, despite Maghrawi not supporting the PJD, in fact supporting the PAN party, does also, I think, suggest the limited electoral weight and value of Dawla al-Quran as a swing base. And so what this means in terms of the actual value and use of Maghrawi to the regime is not clear, but I think it might have decreased in terms of its electoral kind of weight, essentially, in votes. Yeah.
Okay, so I will take the questions from the Q&A. Alice, I believe that you addressed Amin's question already. So the second one is by James Watt, again for Alice. Yeah. He's asking whether you can comment on the Senussi roots of contemporary political Islam in the east of Libya.
Yeah, so what James here was referring to is the Sufi reformist movement that was established in Libya in mid-19th century and then came to thrive in the east of the country, in Cyrenaica. It's connected also to the anti-colonial struggle and to the independence of the country as the first king of Libya, that one and only king of Libya was from the Sanusia. This movement was from the same family. So in terms of the roots of contemporary political Islam, I would say that the most important aspect is the one that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, and that is these Sufi traditions and a particular type of Sufism, looking at reformist trends and ideas, but in particular, the important aspect is the connection with the tribe as a social structure, as a forms of social organization. So in this sense, we see a very strong connection between Islam and tribes. And that is become a sort of an alliance, so to speak, that becomes, that poses an obstacle to the type of Islamism of the type of the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance. So I think probably this is where his question is going. And yes, I would say this is certainly an important aspect that kind of also help us to explain why the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood in itself has not managed to gain a strong foothold inside the country other than the repression of the regime.
Okay, so we have a question from an anonymous attendee, which is about Maghrawi, and it's addressed to Guy, I believe. It is asking about bankrolling by the Saudis and whether you're aware of contemporary the current developments with regards to that. So Guy.
Cool. Thanks for the question. Yeah, it's a really important question. I mean, certainly since 2008, when Maghrawi sort of went into sort of voluntary exile with the closure of his centers, he has started to spend much more time in Saudi Arabia itself. And so in recent years, he spends almost half the year, despite being this key Moroccan Salafi figure, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, giving lessons, conducting television interviews, and so on and so forth. So in terms of where he spends his time, he clearly has very strong connections still with a range of different Saudi institutions, particularly those much more aligned with Ibn Baz, who he studied under in Medina when he was a PhD student. In terms of the sort of bankrolling by the Saudis more generally, it's very hard to get any real sort of clear handle on precisely what happens. And I don't want to sort of obviously speculate. What is definitely clear from conversations with local observers, analysts, academics and things is that Saudi and Kuwaiti, for example, publishers of books bring huge quantities of sort of Salafi, kind of broadly Salafi-minded texts to Morocco every year for the Casablanca book exhibition. And that through this process, these books then circulate and find their ways into Salafi bookshops, but also publishing houses associated with Dalacoura and other Salafi groups, often at heavily discounted prices. So there's a sense in which, it's not necessarily, it's other forms of material resources which are in circulation between the Gulf and Morocco more generally. There are also kind of rumors and suggestions that students, and this is as a long-standing practice, that students who, through Maghrawi's close connection to the sort of Wahhabi establishment in Saudi Arabia, students from Dalacoura on their return from studying in Saudi Arabia return with, small funds which they were given for their studies, but which they don't use, and this then ends up in the hands of some of these organisations. But beyond that, it's very unclear, and I wouldn't want to kind of speculate beyond that. It's just a sort of general sense. Thanks for your question.
Yes, indeed. Separating myth from fiction in these cases is very, very difficult. I think there's another question for you, Guy.
Oh no.
Which actually connects to some extent to what I was asking, which is from Najli Ben-Barek. What is the real influence of these of the Salafis on the ground, apart from the Quranic schools? Are there speeches and videos sparking debate at the national level in Morocco? So perhaps the question is inviting you to make connections with the broader context. If you could.
Okay, great. Also a great question. Thank you. I mean, yeah, absolutely. My research is very much more focused on this kind of local politics, and so drawing these connections is something I think I need to do more of. Certainly, so when Hamad al-Qabbaj ran for, or attempted to run as the PJD candidate in 2016 in the legislative elections in Morocco, this became a genuinely national sort of talking point, both in terms of the surprise that he was running for the PJD, particularly in Marrakesh as a sort of, obviously, a hub of tourism, and there was a kind of nationwide dispute as to whether this was appropriate, whether he should be even allowed to run as a candidate. So certainly on that level, it gained sort of nationwide sort of kind of weight and interest. More recently, figures like Hamad al-Qabbaj, particularly through his role as a sort of editor and contributor to the Hawiya press, the sort of Salafi-leaning independent press in Morocco, he publishes articles on a range of different issues, and these do have kind of national circulation and national level in terms of how they're consumed. He's also amongst a kind of a broader sort of religious conservative milieu in Morocco. He's become, I think, an increasingly important figure and source of religious knowledge, but also sort of social political instruction as well, through his online social media and his different institutions. And then in terms of Maghrawi himself, much less so. He has much sort of smaller kind of public presence these days, and that's obviously very strategic to ensure he keeps the Mahsan's favour. Although the recent Imlil killings, murder of two Scandinavian nationals outside of Marrakesh, saw Maghrawi return to the sort of national debate and national headlines, particularly as some of the alleged kind of essentially killers were understood to have studied at Maghrawi centres, I think 10 or 15 years ago. So it was in that sense Maghrawi came to the sort of national debate. Yeah, I could go on, but maybe I'll leave it at that point. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question from Bruce Stanley about cities. It's not addressed to any of you in particular, but maybe I'll try to explain the question as I understand it. He says different cities offer different political spaces and contexts for everyday politics. Have you noted some interesting cases of supportive or repressive political processes of Islamist groups in certain cities rather than others. So perhaps from the perspective of local politics, but urban politics, maybe we can, or you could try to connect with Islamist ability to operate, or sort of try to see or explain how certain urban milieu allow for the flourishing of certain types of groups. I don't know if any of you wants to give this question a try.
I'll just briefly say from a Libya perspective, I can see the relevance of historical roots. So for instance, there will be some cities where, you know, we can find, like, I'm thinking of Derna, or I'm thinking of like Eastern Libya, where there are connection, in particular when we look at Salafi jihadism and the movements in the 1980s and 1990s, and this kind of like almost like family links now that run across time. So you can find this type of like connection, but I cannot think specifically of urban space or like that kind of context. If other than probably in Libya in general, we see these movements being more successful in cities rather than in the kind of more rural areas or like outside in the desert, maybe, but I wouldn't be sure, to be honest with you.
Alexis, maybe in terms of Tunisia, there's an interesting consideration there, because we do have, if one thinks of the geography of Tunisia, then perhaps there's a comment there about Islamist politics would flourish. I'm not sure I understand the question very well.
I'm sorry, like it would be hard for me to answer this question, as I focus more like on like a state institution, like national institution, and my focus on like the local power is a bit less important. So I don't want to make a definitive statement on this question. But I know, like, for instance, in Egypt, like there are some cities which are associated with some movement, like for instance, like the Noor Party, which was the second most important party in Egypt, come from like a Salafi organization, which is very tied to the city of Alexandria. But it would be hard for me to make like a very conclusive or general statement about like urban settings and development of Islamist political parties. That be a bit beyond my academic capabilities.
Guy, did you want to make a comment on this question about cities?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Again, probably echoing Alexis here. I'm not totally comfortable to sort of set out something particularly clear. I mean, beyond saying that clearly a lot of this kind of quietist, scholastic Salafism has developed in Morocco since the 70s, centered on Marrakesh as a particular urban space. And the growth of Dalacoura and its presence through the 80s and 90s coincided with the expansion of the city and the emergence of kind of suburban and peri-urban spaces, satellite sort of villages outside the city, where up until recently, Dalacoura has had quite a considerable presence in terms of its centres and its activities and so on and so forth. That's about as far as I go in terms of like the spatial dynamics of the group, but maybe that's helpful in some respect, yeah.
So I'll take the next two questions together because they are both about violence. One is broadly asking, why are certain types of Islamist groups tending towards violence? And is this an action, a kind of sort of purposeful decision, or is it a reaction to events or to structures? And this connects with the next question, which is about dictatorship. Is it the this is not just about Islamist movements, it's about violence in the MENA region more generally, but perhaps you could touch on your subject, which is Islamism, in relation to the effects that dictatorship, repressiveness more broadly have had in the emergence and perpetuation of violence. So whoever, please.
I'm happy to go fast very briefly. I think, yes, I would for sure say that there is an effect of dictatorship, but more in general, my statement would be there's an effect of violence. And this is what we have seen, for instance, in a context like Libya, when at the beginning of the revolution, like the revolution itself created an opportunity for people to arm, for movements to arm. And then once you enter into that space, it becomes that violent space. And like, you know, it becomes extremely difficult to step back or to, you know, give up the weapons. Like the weapons become your way to actually survive. And so I think then we get into a vicious circle that leads to more and more violence, and actually, you know, demands political actors to connect to armed groups or to get the support of armed groups in order to be able to kind of support on the ground their instances. So I think more than in the case of Libya, where there's no longer a dictatorship, but in the last 10 years, we have seen an incredible level of violence that becomes in itself, I think, you know, a reason for these movements, like others, to arm and to become violent.
Anyone else?
Yeah, just to say like that like the presentation I made that shows that like the question itself is a bit doubtful, like to make a connection between Islamism and violence, because I focus on groups whose like act is to pass texts, so pass bills. So that's really non-violent forms of politics, enacting law. I mean, like if you just publish a text and make it as a law, it's not violent at all. But like there are work like about from Burga, I would say that, and I don't want to make generalization, but at least in the case of Egypt, saying that the level of violence has been set by the state, and what Islamists have done is answered to the state level of violence. So it could be a worthwhile lecture for the person, worthwhile reading for the person who has asked the question. Maybe read about Burga and the connection between political Islam and violence and state violence. Yeah.
Okay, so we're running out of time, so I'll take two questions together. The first is about the role of Turkey. So a question about Turkey's support, particularly of the Muslim Brotherhood movements in Libya. And then there's another question, perhaps for Guy, on the current state of Salafism in Algeria. So maybe you want to each in turn take a stab at these.
Yeah, again, very briefly, for sure, there's a big and very significant role of Turkey in pushing Muslim Brotherhood across the region and in Libya in particular. But I think what it's more interesting, rather than like, of course, observing this fact, is to see how this is part of regional alignment, and it's part of a process that sees, on the one hand, Turkey and political Islam and its allies at a national level trying to form, like, you know, a political alliance it's not a political, I'm not suggesting any transnationalism here of the sort of like one big state, but like a political alliance that then can help and support the different groups and different factions in different times. So you got that one on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have Gulf countries and Egypt for sure, that are kind of like opposing each other. And this becomes this polarization that materializes within different national contexts in times of violence, like in this case in Libya. So I think these, the support of Turkey in itself for these groups cannot be read or understood rightly without considering also the other side of the spectrum and this like regional polarization that now has characterized the region for 10 years, certainly with a great significance since the uprising since 2011.
Guy?
Yeah, again, really good question in terms of Algeria. I mean, compared to Morocco, post 2011-12 in Algeria, these more kind of quietist, as you said, more Madkhali leaning groups in Algeria didn't appear to undergo the sorts of shifts in discourse and practices that we saw Maghraoui and other members of Dalacoura undergoing. And clearly the protests in Algeria in this period were considerably more limited. I mean, other kind of reflections and comments, but I guess the quietist base in Salafi base in Algeria has a much larger support base, and I think it's considerably more powerful than the quietist sort of Salafi trends in Morocco, and this is linked to the space that the Algerian regime is given to these groups, particularly during and since the civil war in Algeria, to develop their quietist call as a sort of counterbalance to obviously the violence of the 1990s. Another important difference, I suppose, is that compared to Morocco, many of these quietist sort of Madkhali leaning groups in Algeria, were simply not shut down in the period prior to 2011, and so by 2011 had very different priorities, right, to maintain their standing and their privileges in Algeria. Whereas in Morocco, the priority of these quietist groups like Maghraoui's Dalacoura was to seek out group survival by ensuring that the regime would reopen it and allow the centres to operate again. So quite different sort of differences there. I think it's also worth mentioning that the sort of, as you said, this Madkhali thought in Algeria has a much stronger hold amongst the quietist communities than it does amongst the quietist communities in Morocco. Maghraoui and many of the kind of grassroots members of the Dalacoura I spoke to were somewhat critical of Madkhali thought, and they expressed their proximity rather into the thinking of people like Ibn Baz. So there are sort of different international kind of connections going on here in Morocco as opposed to Algeria. And I guess the final thought is just interesting in recent years how key Madkhali quietist Salafi figures in Algeria have ended up kind of knee deep in internal contestation and disputes amongst each other, particularly between Ali Ferkous and other quietist figures. And so there's kind of growing kind of fragmentation within the Madkhali scene in Algeria. Yeah, I'm very happy to sort of have email correspondence with you. I think that was, I forgot the name, but McAllister, so we can talk about that in more detail afterwards.
There is a question about Egypt, and we're running out of time because it's 2 minutes to 12, and I want to bring this to a close, but I just wanted to ask Alexis, you didn't talk about Egypt in your paper, but I wondered if perhaps you can comment on the prospects of constitutional reform in that country in 1 minute.
So I wanted to say, like, law is a matter of interpretation. So it's not a matter of causality. So it's not because the law says so that people act so. And it's a matter of interpretation, and it's a matter of legitimation of state's power. And you could see that, like in Egypt, because like the constitution which exists under now the authoritarian regime of Sisi is quite liberal if you read it, but it has been interpreted in a way which is cruelly authoritarian. So having said that, like the impact, the direct impact of law is limited. Having said that, there has been reform which has been done by Sisi to kind of still legitimize the authoritarian rule by focusing on like the judiciary, which could have emerged as potentially as a dissenting body. So there has been reform which has been made two years ago to kind of strengthen and legitimize the grip of the authoritarian elite on the judiciary in Egypt. I'm sorry, like I wasn't comprehensive enough, but we only have 2 minutes. I only had 2 minutes.
Well, I will just finish by saying that you have all given us a very rich interpretation of events. My sense with regards to the question of the panel, which is, do we have a kind of do we have a rise or a decline? My sense with regards to this question is that, well, what we have is politics as usual. We have politics in all its complexity. We have ideological politics in all its complexity. And it is very difficult to generalize across the region, except to say that there has been quite a sort of active participation on the part of these different movements within the political context. We see that in a variety of ways. We see it in the legal context, we see it in the ideological context, we see it in the national context as well. So thank you all very much. It has been a very informative and an interesting panel and a great start to the day. Thank you so very much. Bye.
Okay, I'm quickly going to say some housekeeping. So we now have a 1 hour break. The first panel is over. Our next panel starts at 2 p.m. and it's about religious voices, grassroots movements, addressing peace building. So big thank you to everyone in this panel. And there's a second Zoom link that everyone received to sign up to the event. Thanks a lot.